In this lesson, I'll show you how to use a switch statement or a case switch statement as an alternative to an if statement. Sometimes it can be more effective, a little more readable. Other times you've still got to use the if and the else if and the else. This just allows you to take advantage of another structure that Java has available if need be. So I've got a program here that, when run, will allow the user to choose a color, enter a color, and a message will be displayed based on the color that they've entered. So I've got an input text field where they'll enter a string, and when they click on the button, information about that string will be displayed to the screen. So let's say the user would like to know about the color blue. They can click enter, and the message will be displayed in the text box below. If they enter a color like red, a different message will be displayed. Now if they enter anything else, for instance, maybe a color that's not necessarily been colored or been coded for, you'll see there's a message saying sorry. Also any other value, so an integer, special characters, spaces, so on, that same error message will be displayed. Well, how does this program work? Well, you can see that there are a few preset colors that are checked to see if they're entered. So we simply have an if statement that takes the color from the user's text field and it checks to see if it's equal to blue, red, green, or yellow. If it is equal to those, then in this case what you see here is a string called output that's updated, and then the label is set on the bottom with that string. So rather than having the set text every time inside each of one of these blocks of code, inside of these delimiters, we have instead just the output being updated each time and then being set at the bottom. Now, a comment about braces. You have likely noticed that in class I've included the braces, one of which follows the if statement, and then the closing brace is actually lined up with the if statement on the left-hand margin. If you'd like, you may also do a couple of other things in terms of placement of these brackets. If you've ever had trouble in terms of noticing possibly that your code has given you error, let's say, where you have a bunch of red lines and a bunch of error messages all over, what you've noticed is you've missed a bracket somewhere. To avoid that problem, what I'd suggest you do then is include these curly braces on the same level. So include them all along the left-hand margin so that you can check to make sure you've included the opening and the closing bracket. That's one way that you may actually create these if statements. The other option that you have, however, is if you've gotten used to making sure you don't forget any of the brackets, you may take these and actually include them before the next condition that you're checking. So I can take the first opening bracket and put it at the end of my if statement, and then I can take the last bracket, the closing bracket, and move my next condition right after it. So you can see here I can combine them all on the same line, and I've got no lines containing only brackets. So there are a couple of options if you would like to condense your code. However, I recommend that if you've ever run into errors, or if this is something that you're new to, programming that is, and you're still getting used to it, that you include the brackets one on top of the other, like you see here. So in this if statement then, what you can see is the string is checked against each color, the output is set. Now, a case switch statement or a switch statement does the exact same thing here, except it does it in a little bit of a more elegant manner. So if we scroll down, the other option that you have is to include this keyword switch. Now, inside the brackets then, what you're going to do is include the variable that you're going to check. In this case, it's a string. And I'll show you an example in a moment of how to use an int or a double value to check as well. In this case then, whatever variable is included after switch, you have a bracket, a curly brace, that includes all of the code within it in one block, and then each line you'll identify a case. So in the case that the color is equal to the string blue, notice here that there is a colon, and then once again we set the output and we include this break keyword with a semicolon at the end. So this structure, the format, is standard. The only thing that you'll need to change then is the case, and of course the variable that you're checking this against. So here I've got a case where the string is red, where the string is green, where the string is yellow, and in each of these cases I'll change the output depending on what the color is. Now notice that in the else condition of the if statement, we had everything else being caught. So here, if the color wasn't equal to any of those four, then we would have entered this block of code. The same thing can be done with a switch statement, except here we use the keyword default. So we don't have a specific case at the end. If you'd like to include the else component, then you can include this default option. And if you don't want this included, however, you can just remove it and you can still run the switch statement like you see it. However, in this case, we want to catch all other input to make sure that we say something to the screen. And this works the exact same way that the if statement does. So if I, in fact, delete this if statement and run my program again, you'll see that the same functionality exists. And now it exists because we're using this switch statement to test the user's input. So if I enter blue, the interesting fact is displayed to the screen once again, since the case has been recognized as one of the cases that we have identified. So the other thing you can do with the switch statement is you can check not only strings, but you can check integers. Now, the important thing is that depending on what you're doing with the values, you'll be able to decide which one is easier to use. So for instance, if let's just say I had a specific 2 inputs that I was looking for. Let's just say I was asking the user if they would like 1 hot dog or 2 hot dogs. I'm only looking for 2 specific numbers, so I could actually use the input from the user. Here I've called it color. Instead, I could call it number. Notice that it's actually still a string. And I could use that number to test it against the values 1 and 2. Even though I know them to be integers, if I'm not going to do anything with them, I can simply include 1 in quotations and a 2 in quotations and delete the rest of my cases. And now I've checked if the user's entered a 1 or a 2. And any other value that the user would have entered will be caught in this default case. So if I update my output here to represent how many hot dogs, let's say, that the user would like, here I have you would like 1 hot dog, and we'll change that for the other to say you would like 2 hot dogs. And the last one is sorry, I've got nothing. I don't know what number or value that you've entered. Whether they've entered a number or a string, we should be able to catch that in this last default condition. So if we run this again, there's not much different about this program, because really we're still testing a string. It's just that we're looking at it as if it's an integer. So here, if I enter the value of 2, I see that you would like 2 hot dogs. If I enter the value of 1, I see the 1 hot dog statement, and anything else, whether it's a number or a letter, will be caught. Now, if I wanted to do something with these values and let's say display a price, I would have to go and take this number and convert it into a double value or an integer value. So let's say I called this input. What I would need to do is then create, let's say in this case it's going to be an integer, so I'll create an int called number, and I'll make sure that I take that input, and remember we use the parse int or parse double functions to turn strings into integers or doubles. Now that I've got a number, notice that I don't have an error on the switch component because it's a valid check. I'm allowed to check integers. But now I do need to check because this says that the case is a string, and it's going to tell me right now I can't compare a string to an integer, so I would need to change this then and remove the brackets. And notice that if I simply just put the number 1, which is an integer, I have no errors, and these 2 values can be tested. So if I wanted to, I could go ahead and say that the total cost is, let's just say our hot dogs cost $3 each. I could do a little bit of math here and multiply the value of the hot dog times how many they wanted. So let's say they wanted 1 hot dog. I could say the total cost is, and multiply number times 3. And I could do the same thing below. Now you'll notice in this case what's going to end up happening is that I'm automatically converting my input into a number. So I would generate an error if I didn't enter an integer value in the input, because right now it's automatically trying to convert it. So in some cases, using the switch statement doesn't allow you to do as much error checking. So if you ever need to check for the input, the switch statement, you'll need to make sure that you test it as a string. And you'll see what I mean here in a moment. So let's run this file. If I want 1 hot dog, I see the total cost is 1 hot dog times 3, or 0.3. You can see there's some calculations we need to update here. If I wanted 2 hot dogs, it's double the price. Now, like I said, if you enter anything else here, if it's an integer, that's not a problem. Let's say 9, you will get the error message because it's been able to convert 9 into a number right here. But if you enter some sort of a text or a string that cannot be converted into an integer, you will notice that your program will crash. So the switch statement is useful. If you would like to make sure that you're testing for all of the input, then make sure that you're testing a string. So if I undo what I had just done here and change this back into a string, now my cases work properly. I don't have to worry about crashing the program. So the switch, or the case switch statement, can be used to replace an if statement if you've got multiple checks. Just make sure you're always aware of what type of variable you're going to check. I recommend always checking as a string if you've got to make sure that your program doesn't crash. Otherwise, if you're going to be converting the value into an integer or a double, it's likely the case that you'll be best off served using an if statement.